Welcome the timeless forgotten mystery. Hello friends. On April 11, 1970, a rocket thundered into the sky from the Kennedy Space Center in America. It was the Apollo 13 mission, NASA's third attempt to send humans to the moon. On board were 3 brave astronauts, heading toward a dream they had prepared their entire lives for. Less than a year had passed since Neil Armstrong had taken that historic first step on the lunar surface, and this crew, inspired by that success, was filled with confidence and excitement. But what they didn't know was that their dream of walking on the moon would soon turn into a desperate fight for survival. When the spacecraft was about 330,000 kilometers from Earth, a sudden, deafening explosion echoed through the cabin. The entire spacecraft trembled violently. In seconds, warning lights blazed and alarms screamed. One of the oxygen tanks had burst, and the other was leaking fast. "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here." "This is Houston, say again, please." "Houston, we have a problem." At first, Mission Control thought it was a sensor error, but the astronauts could see the gas venting outside the window, precious oxygen escaping into the void. The explosion had knocked the spacecraft off course, and it was now drifting thousands of kilometers away from Earth every second. Within hours, Apollo 13 was farther from Earth than any human had ever been, a record that still stands today. Forget landing on the moon. Now the question was, could they even return home alive? This is the incredible, nerve-wracking true story of Apollo 13. In 1961, US President John F. Kennedy promised the world that before the decade ended, America would land a man on the moon and bring him safely back to Earth. This bold declaration was made during the height of the Cold War, when the US and the Soviet Union were locked in a fierce space race to prove technological dominance. By 1969, Kennedy's promise had been fulfilled. The Apollo 11 and 12 missions succeeded. Astronauts walked on the moon and safely returned home. But after this great triumph, public interest began to fade. The first moon landing had been a spectacle, the second, a repeat, and by the third, people were already bored. NASA's budget was slashed, and several future missions, including Apollo 20, were cancelled. Apollo 13, therefore, became a crucial mission. NASA needed to prove that space exploration was still worth funding. The goal was not just to collect moon rocks, but to demonstrate that humans could work effectively in the lunar environment, an essential step for future exploration. The Apollo 13 spacecraft had 4 main parts: the command module, the service module, the lunar module, and the launch escape system. The command module, a small, cone-shaped capsule just 11 feet long, housed all the controls, instruments, and life support systems. Attached to it was the service module, containing oxygen tanks, fuel cells, and the main engine. Together, they were called the Command and Service Module, CSM. The lunar module was designed for moon landing, while the launch escape system was a safety mechanism to pull the crew away if the rocket exploded during liftoff. Since the launch went smoothly, the escape system was jettisoned soon after takeoff. The crew consisted of Commander Jim Lovell, lunar module pilot Fred Hayes, and command module pilot Jack Swigert. Interestingly, none of them were part of the original crew. They were replacements due to unforeseen issues with the initial team. Around 200,000 spectators gathered to witness the launch, far fewer than the 7 million who had watched Apollo 11's liftoff. People's fascination with space was fading fast. But for the astronauts, everything was going perfectly. Their destination, the Fra Mauro crater, a massive lunar basin believed to hold clues about the early history of both the Moon and Earth. The mission was to take 3 days to reach it. During the first 2 days, everything went so smoothly that Mission Control even joked about being bored to tears. Little did they know, their calm would soon turn into chaos. On April 13th, the third day of the mission, the crew was scheduled to test some equipment on the lunar module and do a live TV broadcast. But public interest was so low that no network bothered to air it. Just 6 minutes after the broadcast ended, the astronauts were instructed to perform a routine oxygen tank check. As Swigert flipped the switch, a massive explosion rocked the spacecraft. Warning lights flashed. Alarms blared. Lovell's calm but chilling words echoed through the radio. "Houston, we've had a problem." One oxygen tank was completely destroyed, and the other was leaking fast. The world suddenly woke up. The mission that had seemed routine was now headline news. Apollo 13 was in grave danger. The explosion had been caused by a damaged oxygen tank. It had fallen during maintenance months earlier, slightly bending a pipe inside. During pre-flight testing, engineers unknowingly overheated the tank, up to 538 degrees Celsius, damaging its insulation wires. When it was powered up during the mission, a spark ignited, and the tank exploded. Luckily, the tank was mounted outside the spacecraft. Had it been inside, the crew would have died instantly. Still, the blast ripped open a side panel and crippled the spacecraft systems. Now, NASA had to decide, should the crew turn back immediately or loop around the moon to slingshot home? The first option was faster but required the use of the main engine, which might have been damaged in the explosion. The second option was longer but safer. NASA chose the long route around the moon. The command module was shut down to conserve power, and the crew moved into the lunar module, using it as a lifeboat. But it was designed for only 2 astronauts for 20 hours, not 3 men for 4 days. To save power, all non-essential systems, including heaters, were turned off. The temperature dropped drastically. Their breath froze in the air, but they fired the lunar module's engine, their first burn, to adjust course toward the far side of the moon. At their farthest point, they were 400,000 kilometers from Earth, the most distant any human has ever traveled. Their return path, however, left them with dangerously thin margins, barely enough oxygen and water to survive. NASA instructed another burn, and by doing so, they shortened their return time by 11 hours, buying precious life-saving time. But then came another crisis: rising carbon dioxide. The filters in the lunar module were made for 2 people, not 3, and would soon fail. The command module had spare filters, but they were square, while the lunar modules were round. "We need to fit a square peg into a round hole," engineers said. Using only materials on board, plastic bags, cardboard, tape, and hoses, NASA guided the astronauts step by step to build a makeshift filter. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. It wasn't handsome, Lovell later wrote, but it worked. Water was rationed to just 200 milliliters a day. They were even told not to urinate too much because it could affect the spacecraft's direction. By the time they neared Earth, the astronauts had lost 14 kilograms collectively, and Hayes had developed a urinary infection. As they approached Earth, they needed one final engine burn to correct their trajectory. The third burn for an engine meant to fire only once. It worked again. The world watched anxiously as Apollo 13 re-entered Earth's atmosphere. Then came radio silence. As the spacecraft plunged through the atmosphere, the heat caused ionization, blocking communication for a few minutes. Normally, the blackout lasted 2 to 3 minutes. This time, it stretched to over 4 agonizing minutes. Families, scientists, and millions of viewers held their breath.